Please welcome Paul Born, Tamarack Institute co-CEO and founder, Omar Woodard, Greenlight Fund Executive Director, and Reverend Bill Golderer, United Way of Greater Philadelphia and Southern New Jersey President and CEO.
Well, welcome everybody to a different version of Ideas We Should Steal that we ever imagined, I'm sure. But I think the spirit of this conference, this gathering of way, it really inspires different thinking, different ways of adapting to our current environment and imagining a world that we're currently not living in, but we might want to. And so I'm moderating a conversation between two people that I deeply admire and regard. And let me explain what I mean by that. For me, there are folks who talk about the issue of the intersection of folks who are experiencing poverty and who are longing for opportunity, who are primarily performance artists, who are good about talking about the issue, and then they go back to their lives and don't really worry about it. These are two folks who I have had the pleasure of having long and painful conversations with because they take it to heart and they work on the issues when they're not on camera. But they did us a favor today by appearing with me in this conversation and sharing some of their insight, sharing a lot of their experience. And at the end of the day, where I'm coming from is, and this is a somewhat of a bleak time. I feel like for our fair city of Philadelphia, I think we were all at this time last year feeling pretty good about Philadelphia, feeling like we were making progress. We were on a path that may reach greater and greater prosperity for more and more of our neighbors. And I feel like as we're taping this today, where I think Philadelphia is going to go into some kind of modified lockdown, and that has a feeling of a little bit of a dread for me, not because of the way it's going to impact my life, but because of the way it presents an impediment for so many of our neighbors who are trying to weather this storm and come out on the other side hopeful. So for me, we're really going to focus on not just the challenges that are presented with poverty, but really the underpinning of hope, because there is hope. We can't pursue any ideas that we should steal without hope that things can be different, and then being willing to sacrifice ourselves in a way where something could be different, because it's not going to happen. Ideas are cheap. Energy, commitment, and sacrifice is what moves the needle. So with that as an overly long introduction, but I can't help it because that's how I do things, I'd like to introduce to you someone who you likely know and someone you may not know. I'll start with the local hometown hero, Omar Woodard, who I consider a friend and a co-laborer. Omar is the executive director, or maybe CEO, of the Greenlight Fund, which at its very core and its model, he'll tell you more about this, is really a fantastic addition to the Philadelphia philanthropic landscape, because it does two things extremely well. And it does this in nine markets, 9 cities. It looks at solutions that really do, with an evidence base, move the needle in other markets. But then if it's thinking about bringing those ideas to Philadelphia, it looks at the local infrastructure of folks who perform at a very high level with high commitment and figures out how you weave those two things together, which is not easy, but I think it's incredibly promising. And Omar will tell you more about that approach. Someone you may not know is Paul Born. Paul Born is the co-CEO, which is very telling, of the Tamarack Institute. Paul will tell you more about this work, but Paul's work at Tamarack has really reduced in seismic amounts of poverty reduction at scale. And in talking to a leader in Philadelphia who I'm interested in getting them to invest more in folks' economic mobility, his comment about Philadelphia's solution set to impoverishment. He called it artisanal. We have a big problem and we want to bring forward boutique artisanal solutions. We brought 5 people into a living wage job. Well, Paul is your architect of scale, and he's going to talk to you a lot about the personal journey, but also a scale journey, because the challenges we're facing are not artisanal, they are not boutique, they're big issues. So let me start with you, Paul. Could you build on that little sliver of what I shared, and can you just talk us a little bit about your experience with this topic, but also your approach, the methodology?
Like, I guess, ending poverty for me is all about building a peaceful world. I just want to give that background, and maybe it starts with my own personal story, and I'm not going to tell you the whole story, but my parents were refugees, displaced persons coming to Canada. Both of my grandfathers were executed by Stalin in the Ukraine. Our people were beaten and raped and starved. And so when we came to this country of Canada back in 1949, we needed to heal. And I grew up in that environment. And we spent a better part of maybe 25 years kind of almost as a cloistered community. My entire upbringing was cloistered in a sense within my church community. And we tried to understand a better way. And it was trying to create a better world, trying to build a world of hope, but then also trying to make sure that what happened to us as a people would never happen again. And I thought the only way to do that would be to build an equitable society. And I think poverty is probably the most fractious problem facing the world today. It's the most fractious problem facing Philadelphia. So if we can end poverty, we can create at least more of a peaceful world. There's lots of other stuff. There's things about race and equity and all of that, but all of that is so amplified in poverty. So we started out by building a large economic development organization here in Waterloo region where I live. And I remember, about 12 years into that, the United Nations came to us and offered us one of the 40 best practices in the world. Yeah, it's a pretty good honor. They were flying in from Nairobi, and our city was so proud, and we took the oldest, most historic building, and there's a 400-person celebration with bands and all kinds of things. And at the end, they asked me to come up and speak and receive the award. And I was feeling torn inside, like really torn, right? Like, how do we become one of the 40 best practices in the world when our goal was to end poverty, and yet poverty over the 10-year period that they were adjudicating us on had actually gone up, not down. So I got up there and I did the thing, Bill, Omar, you know how to do this. You got to say thank you to everybody and you do all the right stuff. And then I couldn't do it anymore. And I just said, look, I find it really interesting that you're recognizing us as one of the 40 best practices in the world. And I said, poverty went up in our community for that period of time. I said, what I learned from my business friends is that when you lose shareholder wealth, you get fired, not recognized. So with all due respect, I can't accept this award today. And I walked off the stage. Now, it didn't go over so well, obviously. But what was interesting is that the business people started phoning me. We had a lot of good friends. And we raised several $1 million very quickly. And we ran a campaign, and we wanted to say, okay, if we're going to end poverty, how are we going to do this? And we called it a United Way campaign on steroids. So you know this, Bill, and it's like a 4-year process. It was 1996. We said we want to create the lowest level of poverty in our region by the millennium. So this was our gift to the world, right? And we did it. Now, interestingly enough, our strategy was there's so many great agencies already helping the poor, right? What if we got everyone to work together, first of all? And what if we broadened this idea that ending poverty is not about social agencies? It's not even about government. It's certainly about business. And given that in our country, over 50% of people who are poor are working, right? And it's certainly about people with lived experience of poverty who are living it. So how do we bring those four sectors together? How do we bring government, not-for-profit, charities, business, and people with lived experience? And we built a leadership roundtable made up of equal numbers of those four, which was fascinating because, you know, when you bring people with lived and living experience of poverty into the discussion about poverty changes forever. That was the most important thing we learned. It was honest. People spoke from the heart. People weren't judging. People weren't making sort of broad claims. It had to matter on the ground, right? And so we ran all kinds of projects. I remember even our United Way reached out to every business that it was getting money from and asked each one of them to take just one family out of poverty, right? And we had 200 commit to doing it, and I think it was 163 did. And the list just went on and on. We ran 52 major projects like that, and we did it. We created the lowest level of poverty in Canada. And then a number of people came to us, business people, and said, hey, would you take this across Canada? And I said, no, that's not my gig. But they convinced me. And so today we are doing exactly that work, supporting cities right across the country. We are in 82 regions representing 343 municipalities in Canada. All of them have poverty reduction strategies. And catch this, every one of our provinces and territories, is like your states, they now also have poverty reduction strategies. And we worked with our federal government 3 years ago, and we have a national poverty reduction strategy, clean sweep. Okay, I got to end with this, Bill. Here we are, okay? I spent my whole life at this, right? Pre-COVID, January of this year. We're getting ready to declare the end of poverty in Canada. Our federal government announces, this is pre-COVID, that we just achieved the lowest level of poverty in our history. More than 1 million people had moved out of poverty just in the last 3 years alone, right? And we were now mapping the end of poverty. Now COVID has stopped it. We're working at helping people who are affected. But in May, you'll be there, Bill. I hope you come in too, Omar. We're going to have a big meeting with the mayor of Calgary, who's more popular than our prime minister. He won the Mayor of the World Award. And we are launching a massive conference here in Canada saying, we know COVID is here, we know it's hard, but we don't want this discussion to be about alleviating poverty. We don't want better poor in Canada. We want less poor. We want to end poverty.
So I have a million follow-up questions, but I've got to turn this now to Omar, hometown hero. Talk about your approach. Candidly, I think it's only fair, since Paul shared a little bit of his own journey, I'm going to put you on the spot and invite you to talk a little bit about how you bring your full self to the work you do, meaning who was Omar before the dashing, sharp guy that we are all seeing on screen now? Like, what formed Omar? And then what does Omar do?
First, I have to say, Paul, I hope what I heard you say is, what Philadelphia and what the work that hopefully Greenlight is doing. I hope what you explained is what we'll see in the future. I hope you're articulating our future. my past and my background led me to this work in a circuitous way. Look, I am the son of a 20-year-old single mom who was on child care subsidy, make sure I had WIC, we had food stamps, we lived in public housing. But I didn't know the meaning of any of that until I was 8 years old and walked around the corner with a book of food stamps and realized that's different from what everyone else is using. And when I realized that, I started seeing other things in my life that were different from how more mainstream folks in my life were living. And I recognized an indignity as a very young person. What that's led for me in my career has been to try to solve the problems that my family, my mom, grew up facing. And what that meant was not knowing that philanthropy was a career, but knowing that giving back, regardless if I was working in the private sector or in government, focused on home ownership, focusing on healthcare, focusing on educational attainment, these were all areas that I was deeply committed to. It wasn't until about 10 years ago that I found out about philanthropy, and that it was something, in fact, that you could do and try to guide the resources and capital of individuals who had done well to the highest and best use, with the ends of transforming lives of children and young adults and families who were experiencing poverty, just like I did. And my goal was to ensure that no other family experienced what my family experienced. And so for 4 years, I worked managing a $20 million social impact portfolio in Washington, D.C., focusing on trying to move 20,000 young adults to accelerate their educational attainment, accelerate their employment place, and accelerate their earning potential. And I learned a lot about what was possible in partnership, to Paul's point, with the federal government, state and local government and county governments, and others, particularly the business community, to try to figure out together how might you do something together that you couldn't do alone. But I spent 15 years in Washington, D.C. after going to college there and graduate school and working. And at some point I had to come home. My mother, I have 3 younger brothers. For the first time 3 years ago, she was luckily able to get a Habitat for Humanity home. Right? Nice. And so that was the ability for our family to begin to build wealth and assets. I was 30 years old when that happened. Right. So I come back to Philadelphia, my hometown, and I have the opportunity and the blessing to be the executive director of Greenlight Fund, whose job, Bill pointed out, is to steal great ideas from other places and make sure that they work in the communities that I grew up in and with families that look a lot like mine. And so over the last 7 years, we've invested $4.2 million. We've leveraged $19 million in public and other private philanthropy to focus in areas where we know there are dramatic gaps in outcomes in terms of Black and white. We know the life expectancy challenges based in Philadelphia, but depending on what zip code you're in. And so we took a place-based approach. We focused on young adults coming out of state prison to ensure that they were employed within 2 weeks of coming home. Nice. We invested in a program that expanded by 10x the number of families who could build wealth while in public housing. I could imagine if my mother was able to build assets while we were in Johnson Homes, how much more quickly she might have been able to get to that Habitat for Humanity house. I think about that not just for families like me, but thousands and thousands of families, 30,000 families that are in the Philadelphia Housing Authority. And then we also invested in programs that, looked at pre-K deserts across the city, where there were low levels of quality pre-K and childcare, and we invested it to bring home visiting to those neighborhoods so they wouldn't have to go find it. We would come to them. These are the types of transformative programs that Greenlight invested in, but they're also programs that families like mine and my family I wished had taken advantage of. I wish they had existed, but they didn't, because that program worked really well in New York. It worked really well in Illinois, but the communities that needed it in Philadelphia didn't have access to it. Mm-hmm. So our role is to bring the services and the quality services that every community deserves. If the community needs it, we'll bring it. And going forward, as I mentioned, it's of course deeply personal why I do this work, but I can tell you over the last year, we've helped to transform the lives of 5,000 children, families in Philadelphia. And we just raised another fund to hopefully accelerate that work so we can continue to grow. But the last thing I'll say is the goal, the end, cannot be a 20% reduction in poverty. It cannot be a 10% increase in wages. It has to be the end of poverty. And regardless of how long that takes, regardless of how it manifests, the outcome in Philadelphia has to be zero poverty.
Omar, what an honor. I love it. Just like, you're getting to root cause work, homes, assets, jobs, access, by these home visiting things. I could go on and on about, I love them all. Like they're really core. Philadelphia, my sense just by meeting you and reputation, and man, you got one damn good hockey team. It's a great city, right? I've been there as well, and they're great organizations, like Omar's and others, and they're working at multiple levels, right? You've got frontline services. Omar, I kind of look at your work as more an intermediary, because you're kind of bridging. You're on the cusp of looking at root cause and systemic reasons, and then implementing these macro programs to look at broader solutions, right? That both work upstream and downstream at the same time, right? And then you've got I think what we're kind of bringing to this conversation is this sense of it. I think this is, Bill, what United Ways can really do well is kind of work at a systemic level. My favorite approach is if we knew what we needed to do to end poverty in Philadelphia, I'm pretty sure we'd already be doing it. So the question isn't how do we do what we're doing better? So I have asked this to thousands and thousands of people. And if we were in a room right now of hundreds, I know I'd get the same answer. So I say to them, hey, if we all just worked a little harder at ending poverty, right, in Philadelphia, how many of you think we would end it? Right? And then we'd say, well, look, what if we just wrote one more paper? What if we just got a little bit smarter about ending poverty? How many of you think we would make progress? So if working harder and working smarter, right, isn't going to work, then what is? And I said, but there's one more kicker. Because my dad taught me one most important thing. And that was, he said, if you are the best, Paul, this is kind of an immigrant refugee mentality, you got to be the best. And when you're the best, you're always going to win. Well, we were one of the 40 best practices in the world, and poverty had still gone up. So that myth got thrown out. So then what does get us to work together? Well, and that takes us right to our core process, Bill and Omar. What's interesting is that we said, when they asked me to write my first book, which actually became a Canadian bestseller, which is just bizarre, given the title. The title of the book is called Community Conversations. And it was to write the methodology that we had created. So for the first 18 months, if you can hold the space that long, we bring everybody together and we talk. The first thing we do is we create a leadership team. And that leadership team's role is to build a community or citywide plan. And we bring equal people living in poverty, equal people business, equal government, equal not-for-profits. They're the leadership team. Then we create all kinds of action teams. Then we create a listening team who's going to go out for 18 months and listen and learn and bring that in, and all the people that we've got involved. And then we're going to do a data team, because we are going to just, kick the shit out of the data. We're going to learn like crazy. We need to unify. You've already got the smartest people in your history working on poverty. You got the people who are working harder than they've ever worked in their lives on poverty. You're having more successes in reducing poverty than you have in your entire history, and it's happening right now. The problem is you can't move the marker. And to me, it's a population level problem. And the fact is that the vast majority of poor are moving in and out of poverty every year. Right? So let's for sure get all the people that are moving in and out of poverty, let's just get them to move out. Let's backstop them so they don't come back in. So let's get the easiest ones out of poverty first. Right? Let's just agree on that. Right? Let's start to work with employers to understand the importance of a living wage. Right? And I don't mean that. Like, I'm not a socialist, left-wing kind of thinker. They call me the capitalist socialist around here, right? I love free market systems. I love making money. I love all that kind of stuff. But at the end of the day, it's not good for Philadelphia to have people living in poverty. And the vast majority of poor are working in the service sector. They're not working in manufacturing anymore. Most of the poor jobs got exported, right? I know there's still some. So you're not competing with other countries. You're not competing even with other states. You're basically competing with yourselves. These are all the people serving food, working in hotels. It's the service industry that we need to shore up, right? So all I'm saying is that if you can spend 12 to 18 months building a community plan, really listening, really thinking. Now, here's the kicker. Because we build action teams as we're building a community plan. And our favorite, the city of Hamilton, matter of fact, I hired their executive director many years ago, Liz Weaver, who's now our co-CEO. When they tabled their community plan after 18 months, they also tabled 5 pages of outcomes. So when I say planning is the issue, we also want to unleash creativity and throw out a challenge. So all the partner organizations get very excited. When we did this in Des Moines, Iowa, and we presented the plan, it was like we were at a Billy Graham crusade. You'd be excited about this, Bill. And the agencies, there was like 160 different organizations and businesses. One started, right? And it was like, John Deere supports this plan. And then the housing organization stood up, and then some churches stood up, and then some other businesses stood up, and they're all yelling out, we support this plan, right? And so what happened is that the entire community was unified, aligned under the prioritization, because we took the time to talk about it. Like, how can Philadelphia, right? Like the great hockey town, right? The great town of thinking, the founders of democracy and just the founding fathers of the whole friggin' thing. And you got this amount of poverty? That's just literally stupid, right? So get your act together in that sense. You can do it. You're amazing. Like with talent like you, Bill and Omar, you guys can do this.
In my tradition, when I'm not trying to make sense of the future service that United Way can be to this issue, I've been known on Sundays to do my other job, which is serving the church's mission, the church that looks like the Comcast Corporation got together and made a baby cathedral. And it's kind of a funny optic. But in the tradition, the end is called a benediction. So I'm going to ask you both to give a quick benediction, because the people who, there are a lot of characters in Philadelphia who, their response to our deep poverty issue is somebody else, somewhere else should be doing something else, right? That's a government response. I've heard that in the private sector. I've heard that a lot from philanthropy. If somebody else somewhere else was doing something else, we wouldn't be in this situation. Anybody who is registered for Ideas We Should Steal, these are folks who want to engage. They want to know what we would like them to think about differently, do differently, invest themselves differently. So if you were to give a short, and I emphasize short, benediction that is both a word of comfort and a word of challenge, how would you send us out? Paul, you have it, and Omar, you get the final word.
Well, you heard, stop, drop, and roll. That's what the firefighters tell you. What I'm saying here is stop, listen to each other, and learn your way through this, right? Find the better way. Unify your hearts. Every person in Philadelphia wants the end of poverty. They just might look at it a little different. Let's bring them together. Let's create a plan, right? And then let's work together to bring that plan into reality.
Three quick things. One is we can change the relationship between Philadelphia and the state that structurally causes a lot of the poverty. These are choices. That's number one. Number two, we can change the relationship between Philadelphians and the neighborhoods they live in, so that they see the neighborhoods as something they own, something that belongs to them, and something that sustains them, and hope that they look to sustain over the long term. And finally, I think we can change the relationship between people and politics at the local level, and see how people can invest in the future of their communities by being involved in the decision making about their communities. And these are all small micro choices that can roll up to a big thing. The biggest part for me is the relationship between people and place. If we can, in every way, orient ourselves that our communities belong to us, that our neighborhoods are ours and don't belong to someone else and aren't for someone else to take care of.
Nice.
If we can think that way, then we can begin to change the city, we can begin to change the world. But we have to see it as ours, which means what we live in, the areas we live in, have to reflect our values, have to reflect the things we want and the things we want to do and be, to be the places we want to stay, live, work, and play. So for me, these are all choices. They're not easy choices, but they are choices, and choices can be made differently. And if they are, you can start changing the world, and maybe we can end up a little bit like our neighbor to the north.
Nice.
Thank you both.
Love it. Love it.
Paul,
Thanks, Omar.
I'm so grateful for your presence in this conversation. Omar, I always love exchanging ideas with you and dreams with you. So thank you both. I want to thank Larry Platt and Roxanne and all the good folks at the Philadelphia Citizen who put this all together. I'd be remiss if I didn't recognize our friends at Comcast for their sponsorship of this effort and their technical support behind the scenes to make all this happen. And I want to thank all of you for leaning into this conversation. I really do believe we are in the foothills of a massive climb, but something that could really summit. And when we summit together, we will feel so much better for having done something of consequence that is really living out the love of neighbor. So thank you all for joining us today.
Lovely. Nice way to end, Bill. Thank you.
A special thank you to our sponsors.